So we're recording now. So we'll have the audio piece I'll use and sort of edit down a little bit for the podcast itself, but the video I usually just add up to my YouTube channel, and then just kind of kick off, and I'll just start a discussion, and we'll just kind of get this thing rocking and rolling.
Sounds good.
Here we are. It's an early morning. I got my first cup of coffee right here in front of me, and getting things going this morning. Dan, it's good to have you here on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you are on a quest, my friend. You are sort of redefining. I don't know if you're redefining, but I think what I really admire about what your work does is that you shine a spotlight on what it means to be a man in today's world. And I'm not talking about, I'm not hearing James Brown singing "It's a man's world" in the background. I'm really thinking about the modern man, right, for today. Tell us, can you tell the listeners a little bit about your message and kind of, what is this quest that you're on?
Well, the quest is as personal as it is professional, which for me has been a great fit. But really, it's so evident to me that masculinity and how men are allowed to show up in our society has been changing dramatically, and it's been changing very quickly. And I don't see a lot of intentionality behind that. I don't see a lot of consciousness in our overall conversation about it. I just see it being kind of bouncing around, and yet I think it's absolutely critical to the evolution of our culture, to how well our society functions. Men have held a lot of power. We carry a lot of weight. And if we aren't responsible and conscious about how we show up, we cause a lot of damage. So for me, this is really about finding a way to support men and women in having a conscious conversation, right? So I talk a lot about conscious masculinity. What does it mean for men to consciously step inside the man they want to be and actively choose that man instead of living by that narrative that says that's just how men are, or by living inside of that voice that a lot of men have inside that actually drives, I think, a lot of male behavior, which is that voice that says you're not man enough. And so masculinity is about constantly trying to live up to an ideal we can never match, never hit.
As you describe that, I can't help but think about conversations I've had with my wife about, the way the media portrays women. And, and you do hear some of that narrative. You do hear about, in every presidential campaign, there's always a vein that follows in there somewhere about the war on women. And then there's a lot of talk right now about, gender inequalities from the standpoint, particularly of pay, of everything. But, my own wife, for example, she has a full-time job. And she's married to me, a guy with a crazy schedule. And, we have a daughter who's, almost 4 years old, and she feels tremendous pressure. And I kind of found myself, Dan, maybe in that hamster wheel a little bit from time to time, trying to say, oh, well, I want to be, I'm supposed to be a good husband. I'm supposed to, cater to her as well. But at the same time, I'm like, but I have needs too. And it's not just, a lot of times when, women are like, oh, you just want to have sex and you'll be fine. And I'm like, no, it's really more than that. And I know that's a little bit of your narrative as well, as you kind of unpack that a little bit, in terms of, what is it that a guy really wants? And it's like, I want happiness. I want balance. I want, just a happy life. And
right. So the difference, Scott, is that now men can talk about that. Okay. We've been I don't know about officially, but many of us men, Gen X, millennials especially, have a different take on masculinity, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so we feel permission. We even feel obligation to show up in our relationships differently. 40 years ago, you were the provider. The woman was the emotional nurturer. And that was it. I mean, for the most part, that was it. And we had our boxes and we stayed in our boxes and we followed that, I think, really horrible narrative that said half a person plus half a person equals one person.
Right.
You complete me bullshit.
Right.
And so, my last book, A Man's Way Through Relationships, is all about how do we as men own our relationships? How do we own and learn how we live in relationships? How do we build the skills? Nobody is writing books about relationships for men. And yet your conversation that you're having with your partner is the exact conversation that I talk with men about all the time, that they're trying to have with their partner. And one, for men, they don't have a lot of skill or practice in having it. Two,
Right.
their partners don't have a lot of skill and practice in having it with them.
Mm-hmm.
And three, there's still how many women have internalized all their own BS around this.
Yeah.
I talk about this concept of the water. And for me, it's this broad philosophical concept, but it's really profound. It goes to the little brief story of two fish at the bottom of the ocean, and another fish swims up and looks at them and says, "Hey guys, how's the water?" and swims off. And the two fish look at each other and they say, "Well, what the hell is water?" Right? So that's all about reality, and the reality we're living in or not living in, and how conscious we are of it. And gender is almost the foundation of that reality. What's one of the first questions we ask a woman when she's pregnant? Is it a boy or a girl?
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And then if you decide it's a boy or a girl, you start creating that little person in the narrative that they're going to live in before they're even born.
Right.
So that's how powerful it is. And when I talk about the water, your comments about women, what I find so frustrating is that people want to put this into a false binary, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not either or, it's both and. We're all in the water.
Right.
And so for 50 years, we've been trying to clean out half of the tank.
Right.
And we're wondering why all the fish are still dying. I mean, that's truly what's been happening. So now what I'm saying is, no, let's clean out all the water. Yes, absolutely. We need equal pay for women. Yes, absolutely. We have to stop this epidemic of sexualization, objectification of girls and women. Yes, absolutely. We have to deal with rape. But guess what? Men are raped. Boys are raped. Sexual abuse amongst boys is still practically invisible. And we know it happens at the same rates as it does with girls and women. Yet there's this false narrative out there that says sexual abuse is a problem for girls and women. And the only perpetrators are who?
Men.
Men are the perpetrators. Women are the victims. And so the idea that a man would even be a victim or have recourse from being a victim of abuse by a woman, is so anti-masculinity, that I do a lot of work in the social service systems and in the courts and in the addiction field. And it's amazing how much the male is perpetrator narrative permeates those lines of thought. But it's much bigger than that. It's in our society. And so one comment I make all the time, just because I'm for men doesn't mean I'm against women. No, I don't allow people to put me into that binary, even though they want to, because then they can either feel like victims or they can victimize in their own way.
That's interesting because I when I'm working with business leaders and we're helping teams become more productive or helping groups of people, build better relationships with their clients, I have to remind them that we see the world through the filters that were defined by our own life experiences.
Absolutely.
So I think to that vein, if you grew up in a abusive household, if you grew up in around addiction, if you grew up with certain roles being expected and that just being pounded into your brain your entire life, when you're out on your own, that's how you think the world is. Right.
So let's bring it back to this businessman that we're talking about, right? So mine is to help men find the same success in their personal lives that they're striving for in their professional lives. And I use that language intentionally because the culture of business is changing, and it's changing rapidly. But what I don't hear enough people talking about is how do we support men in really getting there? Jack Myers wrote a great book called The Future of Men, and he's really looking at this issue. And I got a text from a good friend. He just left the addictions field, has gone into the private sector, and he said, you know, I think you would love my supervisor. He just did this talk, or I guess it's more the training director, just did this talk in front of this whole company. And he said, the number one factor in business today is vulnerability. And I think that's great. I hear that all the time.
Right.
But what I don't hear is, how do you teach men who've been taught their whole lives not to be vulnerable to be vulnerable? How do you teach men to be openly emotional when we've been taught all our lives not to be emotional? How do you teach men to ask for help when we've been taught all our lives not to ask for help? It's not as easy as writing a book or going in and doing a 1-hour workshop or a one-day workshop. And what I've found personally, as I've watched cultures of business attempt to adopt these ideas, is it becomes superficial. It becomes this layer of vulnerability that's really not as authentic as it could be, because the consciousness is not as strong, right? So men, I think, I found, have a constant, I don't know if you can identify with this, but this has certainly been my experience. I hear it with a lot of men. There's this constant dance between following what I call the man rules, right? These ideas that we have as men about how to be men, man rules that we learn. And it doesn't have to be bludgeoned into us. We pick it up in the water. It's everywhere, right? But we've got these man rules telling us how to be men. And then we've got these other expectations. And there's this constant dance of, is it safe enough for me to be vulnerable? How am I going to be vulnerable and still be respected? How am I going to feel like a man and ask for help? And I don't hear enough of us helping men navigate that. I just hear us telling them to do that. Just like Dr. Phil and Oprah changing the game in relationships, and then yet holding men accountable and criticizing us for not meeting a level of expectation that nobody's taught us how to meet.
Right.
So there's a degree of insanity about all of this, but I also think there's a lack of completion, because when you begin to really focus on gender and look at gender, I found personally, the whole world opens up. And I experience this in my relationship. I know, as much work as I've done personally, I know the challenges I feel on a daily basis in being able to be authentic with my spouse about how I'm really feeling, about what's really going on with me, while having this wall that says you have to be a man or that's weak, right? You don't want to look weak. You don't want to look like a pussy. You don't want to look like, a baby. You don't want to look like. So there's all that language that men have and that we've internalized deeply that blocks us, I think, from true vulnerability, from true authentic expression.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, if you can't be vulnerable, how can you be intimate? Right?
Absolutely. How can you be vulnerable if nobody's really taught you how to do it?
Right. And again, let's go back to that idea of stereotypes. When a guy starts talking about being intimate with his partner, she will say, "Oh, so you just want to have sex and everything will be okay."
Yeah.
Right. As we kind of get back to that. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And it's not an easy conversation. There isn't a model many of us can go to. Several years ago, I went through a divorce, and it was emotionally devastating for me. And I didn't know how to handle that. I didn't know what to do, and I just kind of tried to do. And I tried to just, I went out, I was a guy. I did a lot of crap in my 30s that most people did in their 20s, running around, acting like an idiot because I was trying to find myself. And what I found was that what I thought I was supposed to be isn't what I wanted. And, it was, I had to re-engage with my spiritual self. I had to, faith plays a big role in my life now. Next weekend, I'm emceeing a weekend event where we're restoring relationships between husbands and wives, and between parents with their sons and daughters, like usually teenagers, early 20s. And, we go out and spend a weekend, and we're doing what you talked about. It's like, let's unlock that vulnerability and just turn off all the noise and get real for 48 hours and
which is awesome.
Yeah. It's
awesome.
It's unbelievable what I've seen happen. And what I hear you saying is more people need to have conversations like that.
Well, and it goes beyond that for me, right? So let's take a weekend like you're going to experience. I've been a part of weekends. I've led weekends like that. Mm-hmm. We work hard to create a safe space where men can do that, right? But then we send them back into a culture that doesn't honor that. We send them back into a culture that doesn't respect that. And we send them back into a home that's not used to that. Mm-hmm. And so what I've found a lot of the time is if we're not preparing men with the tools to take this into their lives after that weekend, it can be really, really dangerous. It can be really, really challenging for them about how to bring that into their lives. And so, my interest is not in the powerful weekend. My interest is in what happens after.
Correct.
What happens so that we can support men in bringing that into their lives as professionals, bringing that into their relationships. I wrote A Man's Way Through the Relationships because when I did my first book, A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, so I come out of the addiction and recovery field. I'm a man in long-term recovery, and that's helped me a lot because having some relational and emotional awareness is part of recovery.
Right.
But I've also felt that tension between masculinity and that for a long time. But when I interviewed men for that book, every single man talked about the importance of relationships. Every single man talked about his struggle in his relationships. So then it prompted me to look and see, well, what's out there? Mm-hmm. What's out there written just for men about relationships? And you know what I found?
Almost nothing.
Goose egg.
Yeah.
Goose egg. I mean, if it was written by men, a lot of the times it's that Steve Harvey BS that reinforces those ridiculous stereotypes. Mm-hmm. If it was written by women, it's demeaning toward men a lot of the time, or it's written from a woman's perspective, which I think is much different than a man's perspective about how to show up in relationships. So in many ways, I've written one of the first books about how to have a man in relationships. That's ridiculous.
Right. You're like,
it's ridiculous.
Do you find yourself going, why am I the first guy that's ever thought that this book needed to be written?
Yeah, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd because I talk to men like you all the time who are trying to navigate their relationships with their partners, who are wanting intimacy, they're wanting vulnerability, they're wanting connection. Mm-hmm. I've got a lot of male friends who are the ones that are pushing their partners to get help, pushing their female partners to go to couples counseling, pushing their female partners for more intimacy and vulnerability. Because women don't know how to do that either. They really haven't been shown either. But a little saying I have is that the way men disconnect from relationships is through isolation and through our front of being a man. The way women disconnect from relationships a lot of the time is by complaining about the man.
Right.
And when the man finally shows up authentically and vulnerably, a lot of women don't know what to do. They're confronted by their own inexperience, by their own fears, by their own challenges. Mm-hmm. And they're also confronted by that part inside of them that has internalized the man rules. And then suddenly they're like, whoa, I wanted you to open up, but I didn't want you to be crying at cat commercials.
Oh, come on. They bring a little tear to your eye. No.
So I get passionate about this because I think we're doing men a real disservice by not having this conversation really, really consciously. And I see it being more reactive or more assumptive, kind of like, well, let's just talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability is going to transform your business. Great. But show me how to do that and live in that authentically without feeling threatened and without it becoming superficial. Right. I mean, you've been around guys and women, but you've been around those people who are pseudo vulnerable, who are pseudo authentic. I mean, like, they're stuck in that persona of sharing things from their feelings and all that stuff. But a lot of the times it's fairly staged, right? You and I are speakers. We know how to stage that. Mm-hmm. And so if you take a deeply patriarchal, hierarchical culture, and then you come in and you put on top of that vulnerability and intimacy and collaboration and all of these current principles of business, there's a deep conflict. And sometimes I see businesses able to negotiate that, and sometimes I don't. But I think when you bring a gender awareness into how women bring that in and how men bring that in, it shifts the whole conversation.
You know, men are often think about things in very tactical nature, right? What can I do? How do I, get something? And sometimes the important thing is just to be. I mean, even in my crazy world, just the other day, my wife unexpectedly said, you know what, I'm taking today off. We're just going to go hang out. And I was like, well, that's cool. Today I was home. And so we went around and, ran some errands and different stuff. And she looked at me in the afternoon and she went, sometimes I forget how much I enjoy just being with you. You're fun to be around. And it's like, oh, wow. I mean, we had to make time for that, right? We're having discussions about how important it is to make sure that, do we get a weekend together to go do something, to get away? I mean, this weekend, today is Friday. Oh my gosh, tomorrow we're setting out. She and I are going to ride the MS 150 bike ride from Houston to Austin. We're going to spend 2 days on a bicycle together with 13,000 other people. But my goal is this: number one, finish. And number two, don't ride off and just leave her. I'm like, let's just go. I mean, our last tune-up ride was last weekend. And she pulled me all weekend. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so proud of you, and it was just like, it was okay for me to go, I don't have to be the man. I don't have to be first. I mean, I'm going to be honest. When I turned that last corner and knew we had 11 miles left straight into a headwind that slowed me from 17 to 8 miles an hour, it stood me up on the bike. And I was like, I don't have to push through this. I can just be me and go, you know what? I don't want to get hurt. I've already been 55 miles today. I'm going to stop. And she looked at me like, if you want to keep going, we can keep going. And I said, you know what? It's not worth getting physically hurt. How many men would have just powered through that last 11 miles to make a point?
Absolutely.
About being a man. And I was like, I realized in that moment when the rider support stopped and he looked at me and he goes, hey man, are you okay? And I was like, I have no mechanical issues and I'm not injured. And he goes, okay. I said, there is nothing hurt but my pride, and I'm going to be all right. And we had a chuckle about it, but I owned it in that moment. Right.
And that's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. And I think we have those moments all the time. So, I'm a pretty intense person, pretty loud, I'm pretty emotional. And bringing these ideas into my most intimate relationships is what's most important to me. I talk a lot about this concept of trauma, psychological trauma. And people ask for an easy definition. And I say, well, a lot of the times the best definition I got from a good friend of mine, Jamie Merrick, and it simply is trauma comes from the Greek word traumatikos, which means wound. So we're talking about psychic and spiritual wounds. And how do wounds heal? Well, they heal differently all the time.
Right.
What do the wounds look like? Well, we don't know a lot of the time, right? So one man's wound might be different than another man's wound. But the key is that for so many of us men, right, having trauma is not manly. Acknowledging the pain in your life is not manly. And yet that pain is destroying so many men's lives. Trauma is a huge part of how we learn the man rules, right? How do we learn not to cry? By somebody gently saying, hey, Dan, don't cry. This is going to be very challenging for you in school
Mm-hmm.
and in your later life because people might make fun of you. No, that's not what I heard. And that's what not a lot of guys hear. And even if you're not hearing it at home, you're probably getting it at school, right? So you could have the most loving parents, and yet you still have to be on the schoolyard. So when you're that emotional, sensitive kid, how are you being treated? And what does that internalize? And what trauma does that cause? What relational trauma? And what I've found is that it's not in the times where I'm up on the stage being vulnerable. I can do vulnerability. I do it well. I mean, I can take an audience to a deep place.
Yeah.
But put me in a really intimate situation with my wife, and it scares the hell out of me. And what I've come to realize, and this is critical, I think, for how we navigate intimacy and help men navigate intimacy, is every time I step into that vulnerability, I'm engaging, I'm triggering potentially that past trauma. Mm-hmm. So the more trauma a man has, the more challenging his relationships are, and the more likely he is to use the man rules to protect himself. The man rules are ultimately about safety. How do I keep other men from hurting me? Well, by my peacock posturing.
Right.
I let people know, right? How do I let women from hurting me? By just sleeping around and not ever getting into a truly connected relationship. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's perpetuated that lie that says all men want is sex.
Yeah.
Or men aren't interested in intimacy, as you were talking about earlier, right? So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to change the narrative. I'm trying to make it so that the conversations like you're having openly and vulnerably with your spouse, with your kids in your life becomes the norm, and you feel supported. And we can teach the men that don't necessarily know how to do that, how to do it. But we don't act as if it's easy, because it's my experience is this is far from easy.
No, it's incredibly hard. And you have to be deliberate. You have to be intentional. You know, I mean, it's and I want to get to this in a minute. I want to kind of bring the conversation back around to how we can demonstrate that, I don't know, maybe that leadership as men, and set that example in the business world. Because I know, like for me, you know, I've got tremendous flexibility to schedule however I want my day and my week. And, you know, I've got, you know, some clients that have been blowing up my phone all morning. We're trying to get some stuff scheduled, but I've put some boundaries up, you know, and as a general rule, I don't schedule many phone calls before 9 a.m. and I don't schedule many after 4. And the reason is, if I'm home and I'm able to do that, then I'm able to look at my wife and say, hey, if you need me to, I can take our daughter to daycare in the morning and I can pick her up that afternoon on a day that I'm home. And, you know, now, does that mean I never schedule around that? No, I had a phone call in the car yesterday at 6:15 in the morning en route to another client appointment. And, you know, that's fine. I'll do that. We're having this call. Well, it's early. We didn't start this until about 9 this morning, but, you know, I will schedule around it, but typically I preserve that time in the days I'm home to still make time for my family. And I have found that the world didn't stop. You know, my business is okay. And you just tell people I'm available here. I'm not available there. You know, what's going on, and those kind of things really work. But what, Dan, in your experience, you know, if thinking about the businessman, how are some ways? What are some actions? What are some things? You know, what is some of those tactical things we could do to let vulnerability show up in many of us who might be in a leadership role, or just might be, you know, wanting to inspire other people around us to be, you know, good men and male role models in the world?
So in the therapeutic relationship, we talk a lot of the time about meeting people where they're at.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I do, and I work hard to do. So what it seems is that our society right now is kind of getting split. So even when some men and women are listening to me talk, they're like, oh God, here's another one of those guys. Right. You know, because they're stuck in that binary that you can't be a strong man, or that strength looks differently than we talk about. So part of how I do it is I just try to meet people where they're at. Like wherever a man's at with what I'm talking about is cool. is good, but let me know where you're at. Let's talk about it. I'm not going to stand in front of you and talk about vulnerability in business and pretend that it's not incredibly difficult for a lot of us men. So I'm going to bring men into the conversation. I'm going to bring women into the conversation. I'm going to talk about what is it like for a woman to be vulnerable and how that vulnerability has been abused a lot of the times for women, how it's been dismissed and marginalized. And so I think that's a piece. I think the other piece is that you then give people the skills to bring that awareness into their day-to-day interactions, right? So you do little check-ins. How are you doing with the vulnerability piece? How are you doing with this? And how are you doing with as it affects you as a man? How are you doing with it? How it affects you as a woman? I just believe that conversation is so powerful that to try to navigate all of these experiences without it, I think we're missing something. And so part of how I think we can work with businesses is bring that awareness into the work that we do, create a space for everybody to have their authentic experience without judgment, and help them find a voice for that. Because there's a lot of guys, I think, who sit in and they hear this stuff about vulnerability. They do the great workshop with you or with me or with anybody. Then we leave.
Right.
Then we leave and it's like, how do I get that back? Because I don't know how to be vulnerable anymore because it's not safe in this culture. You didn't create a permanently safe culture. We created a temporarily safe culture.
Right.
So how do we bring that safety into the ongoing conversation? And I work with programs over a year, 3 years, and I watch that happen. And I watch how the toll that it can take, but I also watch the transformation that can happen, because you can't do this in your professional life and not do it in your personal life.
I agree with that.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
The two just don't separate anymore.
No,
and so I think it's wonderful, but I think it increases the challenge.
Well, I think, people talk about you have to have work-life balance. Let's balance our personal life with our professional life. And I am the first one to call BS on that. I don't think there is such thing as work-life balance. I think we're all in a blender and we're trying to make a smoothie that tastes good. And and that's the analogy that I like. And when that came out of my mouth once in a presentation somewhere, and I got a chuckle, kind of like I did just there from you, from the room. And then I was like, I might have hit a nerve here. And I paid attention to that. Right. And then I kind of refined how I set that up. And then I would share that with other groups and people would go, yeah, and then, what are those ingredients? Well, for somebody with kids, it's, getting kids to dance and gymnastics into the ball fields and getting to the grocery store and having food on the, dinner on the table when everybody gets home and trying to eat dinner together. Right. It's trying to, balance, hey, I have a travel schedule. You don't. I mean, when I schedule with a client or a client asks to hold a date for me to go to their offices and work on site with their people, I include my wife on that calendar invite. So it shows up on her calendar at work.
Absolutely.
That's how I signal to her that, hey, there's a potential that I need to be in this city on this day to go deliver a program to this group. That's helped us to communicate more effectively without really interrupting the flow of our day. So, you think about what's a tactical tool you could use. I'm fortunate my wife has an electronic calendar. She looks at it. At least she knows, because honestly, when we first got married, it was just the two of us. I would go on the road for 2, 3, 4, 5 days at a time. And she'd go, I don't know where you went, but I know when you're coming home. And that was it. And I was like, holy cow, she needs to know where I am.
Yeah.
She needs to know it.
My wife and I have a very similar process.
Sure.
And, our daughter is 6.5. So there's also the issue of needing to be home when she gets off the bus or getting her on the bus.
Yeah.
So even if I have a morning meeting or an afternoon meeting, it is that conversation, and it is being open, and it is about recognizing that even if a man in a relationship, even if our default is to be engaged, a lot of the times the woman's default, because of how they've been raised, because of the woman rules,
Right.
is to have to be in charge, is to have to take care of everything. You know, Brene Brown says the source of shame for men is never wanting to look weak. And I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it. I think for men, it's really just, we just don't want to not look like a man. So whether it's looking weak or looking stupid, or it's this idea of like just not looking manly. But for women, she says, the source for shame for women is feeling like they have to do everything perfectly without, and making it look effortless. And while they have to look good doing it the whole time.
Yeah.
And that resonates with women, right? So even when you and I are talking, how do we create that? It's that both and again. You know, if I just become some navel gazing man who's going and doing all my personal work, but I'm not still, you know, I mean, I found a lot of men who they're checked out of their lives before they get into this personal therapeutic or, you know, consciousness raising work. And then they check out again because they're shifting the selfishness. Now it's like, oh, I got to go to my group because, you know, so I can't really help you with the kids, or you still got that, or, you know, I can't be engaged. And it's at both and. How am I a fully engaged partner? And how do I recognize my wife's tendency to take everything on?
Right.
How do I support that in not happening? How do I consciously interrupt that while at the same time creating enough space for me to do my own self-care, for me to take care of myself emotionally, spiritually? And it's that balance. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. It's not a 9-to-5 balance.
No.
It's a moment to moment, one day at a time balance.
I mean, I can tell, you know, sometimes for me to be a better husband, it means that I have to intentionally go meet up with my men's group to be around other good Christian men, in my case, that live the kind of life I want to live. And what I have learned is that as I've gotten to know these men, and these are very successful business people here in the Houston market, Houston area, tremendously successful in a number of rights. But for me, they're really successful because they are great men in their household. They're fathers, they're husbands. And it's as much attention as they pay to their business, they pay to their spouse and their kids and, you know, and their God. And that balance is positive for me to be around. And I know when I haven't made it to that group very often, because I feel it. You know, I know if we don't make that space, you know, to just, you know, say a prayer at night with my wife, right? That those things, that is incredibly, the funny thing is that I figured out that my, that's incredibly sexy for my wife. Like, she told me one time, one of the sexiest things I've ever done was the day I wrote a check bigger than she thought I was going to, and I dropped it in the plate at church. And she was like, that was pretty hot. And I was like, can you remember that in about 3 hours when we get home? That'd be great. You know? But, and she looked at me and she goes, is that why you did it? And I was like, no, but did it hurt? You know, you know, and you can have fun with it too, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be all, you know, serious. If you can't laugh at yourself, if you can't enjoy your life, what's the point? And for me, it's like, you know what? It's hard work every single day. It's hard work every day. But I applaud you, Dan, for being somebody who's out there who literally, I mean, when you and I first met, just back here a month or two ago, I mean, right from the start, I was like, wow, I know what this guy's about. And that's different. And I like it. And that's why I wanted to make sure we got you on the show to get the word out, because guys, it's okay. You know, you don't just have to be that tough UFC fighter type guy. I would be horrible as a UFC fighter, but I make a pretty good teddy bear. And, you know, that's just who I am. But I'm proud to be a husband. I'm proud to be a father. And I'm, you know, trying to build a business that my whole deal is to create options for my family. And I'm leaving room intentionally for my wife to be able to pursue whatever professional pursuits are important to her, in addition to being a great spouse and partner and lover and friend and everything that she is to me. So thank you, Dan, for sharing that message. Before we go today, I do have three quick questions that I like to throw on the tail end as the lightning round. And I know you've got to head out here shortly. So we're looking for, 15, 20, 30-second answers here. The first two, I think, are somewhat provocative questions. I think they're around some areas. You mentioned Brene Brown, and these are a couple of words that she doesn't like either. But I want to throw them out and kind of just see, in your terms, in your world, in your perspective on things, what does success mean to you?
Well, so I want to go back a little bit to what you were talking about in your kind of closing remarks of sorts. When people hear me talking, I think sometimes they can mishear. I don't have a judgment about how a man shows up. Mm-hmm. You want to be a UFC fighter? Be a UFC fighter if that's the man you are. But if you're being a UFC fighter because you got this voice inside of you that tells you you're a little girl, a little baby, you're weak, and you're never going to amount to anything unless you can beat the shit out of everybody, well, you know what? That's trauma, right. And that's not authentic. But if that is part of your authentic expression, be that man. All I'm engaging men in is conscious masculinity, right? So I don't think you can have a more successful person than somebody who does the work that they need to do to be their authentic self. And we use that word authenticity all the time, but it's like you said, it is hard work. We will never be fully authentic. We just have to own all the times we're not authentic. But to me, that's success. Yeah. If I can show up congruently in all the areas of my life, that's success. If the man you're experiencing here is the man my wife experiences, the man my daughter experiences, and the man that I am out in the world, to me, that's success. I try to be congruent in that. And if I'm doing that, the rest of my life will fall into place. I fundamentally have faith and believe that.
Awesome. What is happiness?
Happiness is a warm gun.
Well, being in Texas, that's a good one. We that may be the opening line for the whole show right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
According to the Beatles. No, what is happiness? Here's what I've learned, right? So I think I've mentioned I'm in recovery from alcohol and other drug addiction. So I know what it's like to scrape the barrel to try to find happiness through material means. And I can tell you that's not happiness. Yeah. And I think a lot of the times we confuse happiness with excitement. I'm happy. No, I think happiness is a nice, steady line. Happiness is that piece of calm. And what I've learned in the years that I've been walking this journey is happiness is a byproduct of right living. It's not something I can strive for in and of itself. It's the byproduct of right living.
All right, last question, the lightning round for you. Here we go. Dan, we love you. We love your message. It's fantastic. It's awesome. It's good stuff. But for some reason, the rest of your life.
There's the but.
But you're going to be banished to a desert island for the rest of your days. And there's Dan. He's out in the world. And with you, you can only take one album to listen to as your soundtrack for the rest of your life. What's on that soundtrack?
Oh, man. Okay, so can it only be one album, or can I make the soundtrack?
It's becoming an increasingly popular suggestion on this show that people build a playlist. So if you would like to offer up a particular playlist or collection of songs, we'll allow that.
Yeah, so it would be my collection of songs, but it would definitely be some of the songs off of Animals by Pink Floyd. It'd be pretty much any Led Zeppelin song.
Okay. Yep.
Alt J, Radiohead, and it would all be surrounded by Bob Marley.
That is fantastic. That is fantastic. And I'm going to leave it right there at that. Dan Griffin, thank you so much for being on the program today. We really enjoyed having you. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks for having me. I love what you're doing, and I appreciate all the efforts you're making to put this message out there and to have that same congruence in your life. Good luck on the bike ride.
Thank you. I'm going to go be a man. We'll see you,
man
buddy.
Up. All right. Yeah.